Hi. So after my last video, I had an interesting exchange with a viewer from Sweden who goes by the name Ralph Nissel, I believe is how you might pronounce that. In that video, which was about courage, fear, and danger, I had suggested that a lot of our specific fears and phobic reactions are really about the threat of experiencing pain, and ultimately, death. For instance, our fear of heights isn't so much about heights per se, but about the possibility of getting hurt or dying by falling. Our fear of losing our job isn't about having less money per se, but about the prospect of suffering privations, and ultimately about the threat that we won't be able to sustain ourselves in the world. Anyhow, Ralph asked what I thought was a very interesting and challenging question. What is the deepest source of our fears? The kind of thing that serves as their hidden foundation, even for our fear of death. And so that's what I'd like to explore in this video. So yeah, tip of the invisible chapeau to you, Ralph Nissel from Sweden, for the inspiration and for the challenge. And as usual, here's a table of contents for the material in this video. And also as usual, you can find the same table of contents in the description section of this video, along with links to the timestamps. Okay, so I should probably begin by making note of some of the difficulties inherent in exploring the deep nexus of our fears. And probably the first of those would have to do with how easy it is, especially in the West, simply to defer to a narrowly scientific account of our fears. An account that would probably go something like this. Well, our fears are ultimately based upon the fight or flight response that's been woven into the reptilian parts of our central nervous system by way of evolution. Therefore, in order to understand our fears, we must focus primarily on comprehending how the amygdala works, as well as the hypothalamus and sympathetic nervous system, and how those systems have evolved relative to environmental demands. And while all of that is undoubtedly true at one level of description, the problem is that that approach doesn't do much to help us deal with our fears at a more personal level, at the level where we actually experience life. If we want to understand our fears in that more personal way, what we need is an approach that speaks to our actual experience much more directly. To put it in a somewhat technical philosophical language, what we need is a much more phenomenological approach, or perhaps hermeneutic approach, rather than a narrowly positivistic one. However, if we were to take such a tack, we'd very quickly encounter another difficulty, and it has to do with the paradox of trying to see what we don't want to see, to perceive what we're invested in misperceiving, to understand what we're desperate to ignore. That's because if experiencing our fears is intimidating, as it often is, then exploring their hidden foundation is probably much more so. Consequently, comprehending the basis of our fears is probably going to be subject to an ongoing deflection away from actually finding what it is we're seeking. And because of that tendency, the closer we get to comprehending the hidden source of our fears, the greater the temptation will be to think that we're wrong. Not because we actually are wrong, but because we don't want to be right. And here we're pretty close to the edge of psychoanalytic territory, which of course has to do with how we repress what we can't tolerate to perceive consciously. So, as we make our way through this exploration, perhaps the most reliable indicator that we're on the right track will be our temptation to reject what we're finding. Basically, the kinds of insights to which our narrowly rational minds almost immediately raise objections, but which our hearts and souls know better. Okay, so having noted some of the difficulties of pursuing this topic, let's start with Ralph Nissel's intuition that the hidden foundation of our fears, the thing that makes death so scary, is the threat of non-existence. In other words, it's not so much that we're afraid of dying per se, but afraid of the possibility of not existing at all. In that regard, our fear of death is really about being overcome by oblivion, about the possibility of being completely consumed by nothingness. At the time, my response to Ralph was that while non-existence can certainly be a pretty scary prospect, I don't think that it's actually the deepest root of our fears. The reason has to do with something that Shakespeare's character Hamlet captures pretty well. Instead of being scary, oblivion can easily be a consummation devoutly to be wished. That's because, as Hamlet describes it, existence as we know it involves quite a bit of meaningless, nonsensical suffering. And so, instead of scaring us, non-existence can easily offer us a kind of compensation in the form of being relieved of all of that unpleasant weight. And as a consequence, it's entirely possible to see non-existence in a positive light, much like Hamlet does, as something attractive rather than something repellent, threatening, and fearful. But, of course, seeing non-existence in a positive light doesn't necessarily do away with our more specific fears, as we might expect if it really were their underlying basis. And so, if non-existence doesn't seem to provide a definitive foundation for our fears, and more specifically for our fear of death, then what would? Well, perhaps once again we can take our clue from Hamlet, who in his famous soliloquy also says that what really puzzles the will is the fact that we don't really know what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil. So from that perspective, it's not so much death per se that scares us, but the unknown. Basically, we're frightened because while we know that death is going to happen, we don't know what's going to happen. And sure, we may have beliefs about what it may be like, but that's exactly the point, isn't it? We have to believe because we don't actually know. And in that sphere, practically all of the world's major religions offer up some sort of account designed to assuage our fear of the unknown, whether it has to do with believing in a Christian heaven or hell, or a Buddhist sequence of future reincarnations governed by the dictates of karma, or possibly a journey with the Valkyries to the storied halls of Valhalla. I mean, it's really impressive, isn't it? How eager we are to believe anything, no matter how outlandish, rather than face the obvious fact that we simply don't know what's going to happen to us. But of course, then the question becomes, okay, but why should we be so afraid of the unknown? After all, the universe is full of all sorts of things we don't know, but that don't really scare us. We don't know if there's intelligent life on other planets or not, but it doesn't seem to be keeping too many people awake at night. We don't know if there's a solution to the NP-complete problem set in theoretical computer science. Once again, doesn't seem to be bothering too many people. We don't even know if there'll ever be a second season of Firefly. I think you get the point. So, why should death be an exception to the myriad unknown things that don't particularly scare us? Well, I think that the answer has to do with two interrelated factors. First, from our perspective, it seems like death will involve quite a bit of change. And second, it seems likely that that change will probably be very personal in nature. That is, it seems like something that we ourselves will have to go through, and that it will define and delimit our lives as individuals. But once again, it's not entirely clear why that sort of personal change should scare us. After all, couldn't we just decide to see it as a magnificent adventure, as something we could conceivably welcome rather than fear? And perhaps some people do see it that way. But I'd say that that seems to be the exception rather than the rule. And so, the question remains, why does deep personal change tend to scare us? Well, personally, I'd say that the Buddhists have the best answer to that question, and it has to do with how we attach and cling to things as they already are, and especially to our ideas about who and what we ourselves already are. And so when we begin to perceive that our sojourn in this world is actually something very impermanent, Well, our fear is that someday we'll have to let go of what we cling to most of all, which is our attachment to life itself, and along with it, our attachment to everything that has given us solace and joy, our attachment to the people around us, the people we've loved, and most important of all, our attachments to ourselves, to the distinct human beings we've been in this life. And so, from that perspective, the thing we're really afraid of is letting go of our attachments. Of course, as Buddhists have also noticed, our attachments are actually the hidden source of our misery in this world. That's because our attachments put us at odds with the greater reality of life, which is the reality of impermanence. Basically, anything to which we become attached is already in the process of transformation, of becoming something else, and of disappearing eventually. In reality, there's nothing for us to hold on to, at least not in any permanently reliable way. And so we're miserable because while we wish that life weren't that way, it actually is that way. However, the fact that our attachments bring us misery doesn't make letting go of them any less scary, especially considering how desperately most of us cling to our suffering. That's mostly because our suffering is part of what makes things seem familiar and, in a sense, strangely comfortable. And if we're honest about it, which we usually aren't, well, who and what would we even be without our suffering, without our wounds and scars? Well, probably not who we think we are. And the scary secret that death keeps whispering in our ear is, well, it's that all of that may have to change someday, and change in the most fundamental and personal of ways. However, I sense that another, probably even more terrifying thing about death has to do with the fact that it's not merely the logical and binary opposite of being alive, although we certainly do like to think of it that way. But if we were to take our bearing from how we don't want to think about it, like I suggested earlier, well, I think we'd have to admit pretty quickly that death is actually an integral part of life. Surprise! In that regard, our fear isn't so much about what may turn out to be the opposite of life. Instead, it's really about what life already is. In other words, it's not so much about what we don't know, but about what we know all too well. And okay, that may seem a little strange and counterintuitive, so let me say a couple things to help it make a little bit more comprehensible. Let's start with something obvious. For instance, isn't one of the more unsettling things about human existence the fact that every single moment we're alive is always bringing us 1 minute closer to death? And by the way, that includes this moment right now. The fact is that if you watch this entire video, you'll be 25 or 30 minutes closer to your death. Woohoo! See, that's how you get lots of subscribers on YouTube. I know, right? Anyhow, so the really scary thing isn't that we're going to die someday. The really scary thing is that we're already dying, already moving along the road to finality, already drawing closer to death's intimate embrace, toward that unfathomable, gradually approaching consummation of everything we are, along with everything we have been and everything we ever will be. You see, death isn't scary just because it's something that's going to happen to us someday. It's scary because it's already happening, already here, and it has been all along. But I'd also say that for most of us, it takes a special act of courage to perceive all of that. Not just to know it as an intellectualized abstraction, but to feel it in our bloodstream. To feel how we're already giving birth and already dying as one moment of our lives gives way to the next. And I believe that that sort of realization is important because it's crucial to understanding the hidden foundation of our fears, which isn't so much about what may or may not happen in the future, but which is deeply interwoven with what we are. I kind of feel like I have to say that a bunch of times because it runs so much against the grain of our popular opinion, at least here in the West. Anyhow, in that vein, at this point, I'd like to incorporate an insight from the mid-19th century Danish philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, or Kierkegaard, I think is closer to the Danish, who, as you may know, spends some time examining the nature of dread, or anxiety, as it's variously translated in English. And while fear isn't exactly the same as dread, I suspect there's quite a bit of overlap between them. In fact, I'd say that our more specific fears are ultimately just ways that our more general existential anxiety has managed to crystallize over time. Okay, so let's take a quick look at Kierkegaard's notion of dread. According to Kierkegaard, I'm not going to say Kierkegaard, I'm going to use the Americanized version. Anyhow, according to Kierkegaard, dread is, and I quote, a sympathetic antipathy and an antipathetic sympathy. Well, damn. Thank you so much for that staggering bolt of revelation there, Dr. Insight. So what does that mean? Well, there are several possible ways of interpreting it. One would be that we're attracted to what repels us and repelled by what attracts us. However, for our purposes, probably a better one would be that we desire what we fear, and we fear what we desire. Of course, that would mean that our desires and our fears are not nearly as straightforward as we'd like to think. In addition to desiring what we want, we're also attracted to what we don't want, and ultimately to what we fear. For instance, with regard to death, it's not enough just to say that we're afraid of it and therefore we want to avoid it. The scarier part of our relation to death has to do with our attraction to it. You know, the strange, sickly sweet beauty of the fading and eventual disappearance of things, including even ourselves. Like dying leaves caught in the cold autumn wind, still somehow radiant in their final burst of glory. It's that disquieting, disarming aesthetic of evanescence, haunting us in the shadows of our forbidden dreams. You see, the fact is that even death has its dark allure, its seductive charm, although it's not necessarily an easy thing to admit something like that. But when you think about it, isn't that part of why we're so powerfully attracted to the genre of horror in literature, films, video games, etc.? You know, things like zombies, vampires, monsters, crazed serial killers, and even the nightly news a lot of the time. Anyhow, the hidden intimacy between our desires and our fears also helps explain a lot of other strange phenomena we can easily see in the world around us. For instance, how often we human beings go way out of our way to generate hell on earth. Basically, the fact that a lot of the time we actively pursue our own and each other's destruction. And if you need a confirmation of that, well, try opening up pretty much any history book. I mean, it's really impressive, isn't it? How much mayhem, hatred, carnage, oppression, barbarism, war, and wholesale extermination there is in the historical record of mankind. And how much self-sabotage, betrayal, deception, addictive behavior of various kinds, and general nastiness there is in the microcosm of everyday life, too. So then the question is all of that really nothing more than an unpleasant coincidence? Well, personally, I don't think so. I think it's because underneath all of our good and noble intentions, we're actively attracted to the negative, thoroughly and definitively seduced by it. And we go out of our way to manifest it in the world, both at the individual level as well as at the level of world historical events. We all have, as W. Axl Rose once famously asserted, an appetite for destruction. Of course, we're also attracted to the positive, but that's a lot easier to admit and understand rationally. The challenge is to realize how the exact opposite dynamic is also alive and well within the dialectic of human affairs. And as a consequence, I'd say that it's not even the darkness outside of ourselves that we fear the most, nor even the darkness of an uncertain future. Rather, it's the darkness that lives and breathes within each one of us, and that ultimately defines our brilliance. Or, as Freud was to formulate the same basic insight almost 100 years after Kierkegaard, it's the fact that our psyches are a composite of eros and thanatos, of creation and destruction, of birth and death. But whether it's cast in Kierkegaard's terms or in more Freudian language, the crucial insight is that many things that at first seem to be opposites, things like desire and fear, are actually woven together much more tightly than we typically believe, or even want to believe. And okay, the truth of that can certainly seem counterintuitive and to an extent unattractive. But that doesn't make it any less accurate. And so, if we really want to understand why we fear, we also have to understand why we want to fear. But at this point, I don't have enough time in this video to go into a deep dive about the reasons for that. But let me at least give you an inroad into wondering about them. If we're honest about it, isn't it the case that when we're really scared, when our fear is fast upon us and rending us apart like a wild animal, well, aren't those also some of the times when we feel most alive? Of course, when we're terrified, it doesn't feel particularly good. But the positive part of it is that it has a way of pulling us out of living on autopilot. Like robots or zombies who are more dead than alive. When we're scared, there's no longer any doubt about whether we're really alive or not, because our terror makes it very obvious. And at this point, I bet that some of you know exactly what I'm talking about, especially those of you who have a history of thrill-seeking, or maybe who just like riding scary roller coasters every now and then. Okay, so where does all of this leave us? Well, it leaves us with the somewhat disturbing realization that the actual source of our fears is nothing less than, drumroll please, ourselves. That we ourselves are the ultimate source of our fears. Basically, it's a scary thing to be alive in this world, to inhabit this strange vale of tears as we do, to be cast into an endless ocean teeming with ecstasy and horror. But of course, that also sets up an important life project for those of us who hope not to be quite so thoroughly ruled by our fears. At one level, that project would involve cultivating enough self-awareness to realize both the true depth of our fears and also how they end up controlling our lives, most especially when we don't even realize it's happening. However, at a somewhat more challenging level, dealing with our fears would also involve learning to live through them. In other words, it's not a matter of doing what we usually do, which is to run from our fears by denying them and or distracting ourselves from them. Instead, living past our fears involves learning to face them honestly and with an abiding willingness to experience them when necessary. And then learning to move forward in life despite all of that. Okay, so let me move toward ending this video by saying a couple things that hopefully might encourage you on that journey. First, I'd say that contrary to our prevailing social practices, there's no shame in being a coward. That's first because cowardice is really nothing more than the occasion for developing courage in the first place. But beyond that, the fact is that practically all of us are cowards in one way or another. It's just a matter of how and when it announces itself. Sure, as individuals, we're afraid of different things and to differing degrees, but the fact is that the cowardly response lives and breathes within virtually all of us. Of course, you can always find someone who loudly claims not to be a coward, but I'd say that around 99% of people like that are either outright liars or not very self-aware or not smart enough to be afraid of danger in the first place, or perhaps a combination of those three. As the old adage goes, it takes a brave man to admit he's a coward. That's because in our culture, there's a fair amount of shame in being called a coward, or even in admitting that we're afraid of something in the first place. And all of those social dynamics definitely make it harder to face our fears honestly and directly. In the West, that's probably especially true for males, but I'd say that it's definitely there for women too. And when you think about it, isn't all of that ridiculous shaming and self-deception just plain silly? Especially insofar as it eventually leads to the paralyzing and self-defeating paradox of being afraid of being afraid. Oh, but I guess I'd like to end this video on a more personal and uplifting note. So I'd say that over the last 60 years, I've found that the more I'm able to name and experience my fears honestly, the less they seem to debilitate and paralyze me. They're still there, of course, but the difference is that I'm less controlled by them. Of course, all of that's definitely a work in progress. But still, I've found that the more I'm able to live with a modicum of genuine courage, the more it seems like my soul is being liberated in the process. But, as I so often say in these videos, hell, don't take my word for it. Go out into the world and see for yourself. Anyhow, thanks as always for watching and listening. And of course, as always, take care of your soul.